In case I haven't met you, my name's Dr. Kate Leisinga. I'm one of 3 doctors here at DBC, and I'm going to be talking to you tonight about breast health. It's a topic that I think for a lot of people flies under the radar until it really doesn't, right? It's one of those things that doesn't get talked about a lot unless it's something catastrophic. And what I would like to do is talk about all of the things that we can work on to decrease our risk, to work on prevention, so that it isn't this taboo subject that we don't talk about until we're in trouble, right? So that's kind of what we want to talk through tonight. Breast cancer, we talk about that. That's one of the most common. I think it's the second most common behind some skin cancers. Types of cancer in women across race, across socioeconomic status. It's the most common, second most common. And it's a growing epidemic too. It seems like every time I turn around, someone's dealing with it, or someone knows someone who's dealing with it. So it's a very relevant topic. If by a show of hands, how many people know someone who's had breast cancer? Oh, yep, see, that's what I figured, right? I mean, it's all over the place, it's everywhere. So we want to talk about things that we can do, ways that we can be proactive so that we can decrease the incidence of some of these more serious breast issues. One other thing I wanted to mention is that we as humans are unique in the animal kingdom in that we have breasts. Animals have mammary glands, but they don't have the same fibrous tissue, they don't have the same fatty tissue. The estrogen, progesterone sometimes works a little bit different. So we're sort of unique that way. And I think because of that, it makes us uniquely susceptible as well to some of the other things in our environment. We're going to talk about toxicity. That's one of the ways that we can lower our risk of breast disease is by managing toxicity. Now, toxicity is everywhere. We can't always avoid it every time, but we can learn to manage it. We need to maintain a healthy body composition. For most of us, that means watching our fat percentage, keeping that low. And we also need to eat plants. I know we talk about that a lot here at DBC, but that is a huge key. Eating our plants, eating our medicine, that's a big deal for preventing breast disease. So we need to manage toxicity, maintain a healthy body composition, and eat plants. Ta-da! Right? I mean, no? Okay, well, we can go through this. That's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, right? This is our estrogen metabolism pathway. And I am going to touch on a little bit of this because a lot of this science translates into actionable steps for us. And that is pretty rare, right? A lot of times we'll see studies come out and they say this or this or this may equal this or this or this, or causation versus correlation. And you say, well, what do I do? Well, we need to learn more. We already know a lot about this. And we know some things that we can do to influence this pathway to our benefit. So we're going to talk about some of that. And that has a lot to do with toxicity. So we'll start there. I know Dr. Dembor last month did an awesome seminar on toxicity, a little bit broader scope. We're going to narrow in particularly on some hormones, the major one being estradiol. Now, who's heard of estrogen or estradiol? Nod your head, yeah? Mm-hmm. Yep, we've heard of this, right? This is the primary female sex hormone. Males have it too, don't get me wrong, but when we think about female hormones, we think estrogen, and usually it's partner progesterone. So estradiol, when we talk about estrogen, we talk about sensitivity, just like we would talk about insulin sensitivity, right? When it comes to estrogen, the breast tissue is the most sensitive to estrogen, okay? So if you're looking for an effect, if you're looking for a canary in a coal mine telling us about how estrogen is being processed in our body, look no further than the breast, because that's always going to be the highest, most sensitive place where estrogen does its work. Okay, and I think that's a lot of the reasons why we see these breast cancers and breast diseases showing up is because of estrogen. Now, exposure has a lot to do with that. And when we talk about estrogen exposure, we talk about over the length of the lifetime. So there are statistics that show that the longer a woman is exposed to estrogen, whether that's because she started puberty early or because she had menopause late, the longer that length of time that her body's being exposed to estrogens, the higher chance she has of contracting a breast disease, specifically breast cancer. It increases your risk. Now, there's not much we can do about that, right? I mean, you or I can't change when puberty hit me or when menopause happens to me. But we can decrease our overall exposure by decreasing how much estrogen is in our environment, how much estrogen is hanging around in our body and in our tissues. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. So it has to do with sensitivity to estrogen. It has to do with exposure to estrogen over the lifetime. And it has to do with estrogen metabolism, right? This guy, this big chemical reaction is estrogen metabolism. So we talk about detoxification, right? In any toxin in our body, any hormone, any chemical that comes in and needs to be excreted, we have a process for that, right? For estrogen, it goes through the liver, and it needs to be bound to these specific compounds in order for our body to excrete it. That's estrogen metabolism. So it's always a good idea to improve your body's ability to detoxify or metabolize these hormones or compounds out, right? Makes sense. We want to get all of that used up stuff out of our system. Interesting thing with a lot of these hormones, and estrogen specifically, there are different paths that can take. So, and some pathways to detoxification or to removing estrogen are better than others, are more inflammatory than others. So when we're talking about estrogen detox, we want to push that pathway, that chemical process, one direction over another. And I've put that right here. You can see 2-OH estrone. See that one right here? That's the good guy, right? That's the angel on our shoulder. This is the anti-inflammatory pathway out for estrogens. Okay? So we are always going to want to talk about, and you'll see me make reference to this later, how do we push that pathway? We want the 2-OH. We do not want the 16-OH. This is pretty inflammatory. This is the guy that gets us in trouble. It's very estrogenic. It binds very tightly to estrogen receptors, and it doesn't allow that normal detoxification that we want. Okay? So 16-OH, that's the devil on our shoulder, right? We want to move 2-OH, not 16-OH. Not if that makes sense. Yeah? So how we detox, that pathway that we take, influences our risk of contracting a breast disease. Okay? How do we do that? We found that there are some chemicals, some estrogens, that are better than others in our environment. Not to mention the stuff that we're making on our own, right? We're going to talk a lot more about what's coming in from the outside. So in 2007, there was a study in Cancer magazine that showed no less than 216 chemicals that caused mammary gland tumors in animal studies. Now, these are not banned chemicals, okay? These are things that are in our homes. They're in pesticides, they're in plastics, they're in cleaners, they're in solvents, right? These are chemicals that aren't necessarily taken out of things. These are things that are around us all the time. And slowly we're figuring out which ones we need to start to remove, but that process happens very slowly. Xenoestrogens is the name that we call estrogenic compounds that come from the environment, okay? They're not made in our bodies, they're not from plants. These are estrogenic chemicals, things that occupy chemical receptors for estrogen. So if you have an estrogen receptor and an estrogen molecule is trying to come by and create an action, it can't because it's already bound up by this xenoestrogen. They turn on estrogenic responses when they're not called for. So there's not estrogen in the system. My body isn't necessarily making estrogen to try to get something done, But these estrogens floating around in the system turn these responses on anyway, right? So think about a prepubescent girl who is we're trying to minimize that exposure to estrogen, right? If we're still getting these estrogenic responses, even though her body is not making estrogen, that increases her risk. Make sense? So estrogenic responses can be good or bad, depending on if the brain is calling for them or not. It also messes with feedback loops. So it can change, you know, what your brain is telling your body and vice versa, what your body is telling your brain. So these chemicals mess everything up. They change how our body responds to estrogen, they change how much our body makes of estrogen, and they change the downstream effects that happen because of that. These xenoestrogens are common in those big, long chemical names that everybody shortens, like BPA. You've heard of BPA, right? Where do we find BPA? Plastics, right? So a lot of plastic bottles will be made BPA free. You'll see that advertised on the side of a bottle, right? The reason is because it has those xenoestrogenic compounds in them that can leach into the water and then get into our bodies and create all of these problems here. PCBs. Does anyone remember DDT? Right, a pesticide? I remember DDT because when I was a child, I was obsessed with the children's educational magazine, Ranger Rick. Does anyone remember Ranger Rick? Anybody else read that? Only one. Oh, I was such a nerd. Am such a nerd. DDT was talked about in particular because it was changing the ability for birds to lay strong eggs. And so birds were becoming extinct because they weren't able to reproduce. That all has to do with the estrogenic compounds in something called DDT. Now, DDT wasn't banned until the 70s. We knew there was bad stuff going on with that for a long time, but we take a while to get these chemicals out of our collective systems, right? And so there are other chemical compounds that come along to try to replace all of these chemicals too that we don't know if they're safe or not. So when we talk about pesticides, when we talk about plastics, we talk about these xenoestrogens, what we want to do is we want to minimize our exposure to these. So try getting a stainless steel water bottle maybe instead of drinking out of an Aquafina off the shelf, because those definitely have BPA in them. Trying to eat vegetables fresh and whole and not packaged in plastic. A big one is not heating your food in plastic because the heat brings out the BPA. Our health coaches have an entire curriculum dedicated to how to get some of these toxins out of your home and out of your environment. So if you're interested, you can talk to one of the health coaches about that and maybe set up a session with them. But managing how many xenoestrogens you're exposed to helps decrease your risk of breast disease. Another thing we can do is get a different type of estrogen compound in our diet. We talk about these phytoestrogens, and we see phyto from the root of plant, right? We think of phyto and we think of plant because these estrogens come from plants. They're estrogen-like or estrogen-mimicking compounds that are actually protective. So they protect us from those more active xenoestrogenic compounds that we get from plastics and pesticides, okay? These are the good guys. They increase that 2-OH pathway. Remember we talked about that a moment ago? Not the 16-OH, but the 2-OH is the anti-inflammatory pathway. So these phytoestrogens help us with that. They also inhibit something called aromatase, and we're going to talk about aromatase later. And they increase SHBG, sex hormone binding globulin. So we talked about how in order to excrete these compounds, we need to bind them, and then the body can get rid of them. This is specific to estrogenic compounds, SHBG. So anything we can do to increase that activity of that binder is going to decrease our exposure to those estrogens. It also, I promised the guys they'd get something out of this too. It also reduces prostate cancer risk. So a lot of these same things that help us deal with breast disease also prevent and help lower your risk for prostate disease. And guys, you're not off the hook entirely for breast cancer, by the way. Over 2,000 people annually, men annually, are diagnosed with breast cancer. And there's a lot of reasons for that, notwithstanding these xenoestrogens, right? Because everyone's exposed to that, not just women. So when we consume phytoestrogens, we are also inhibiting this testosterone to dihydrotestosterone. So that's like your version of 16-OH estrone, right? So this is the inflammatory form of testosterone. It inhibits that from happening, which decreases prostate cancer issues. So there's a little bit back and forth that go hand in hand that way. So where do we get these phytoestrogens? Well, plants. Who knows this one here? Where's a big source of phytoestrogens we talk about in food? Tofu or soy, right? Soy. Now I will point out, we're pretty insistent here at DBC that it's non-GMO soy. You'll hear negatives and positives about soy. If you go on the internet and you type in and you get some articles back, is soy good for me? You're going to get a mixed bag. And we feel that has to do with the quality of the soy, not soy in and of itself. Soy has been found to be very safe and beneficial. It contains isoflavones. Those are the compounds that are those phytoestrogenic, the protective, weakly acting estrogens. Well, soy also often helps. We use soy compounds in a supplement form called Spectra Soy that can help with moods postpartum. It can help with menopause. It can help with hot flashes. It can help with a lot of different things having to do with female hormones as well, because it acts as that weak estrogen, that anti-inflammatory estrogen. Because estrogen's not bad. We need estrogens to function, but we just have so many of the inflammatory kind. It's sort of bombarding us all the time that we need to try to crowd that out with these anti-inflammatory type of estrogens. Lignin, another place you can find these isoflavones is beans. That's why I wanted to put up there. And in a lot of colorful vegetables, greens, apples, a lot of things you wouldn't think of. Usually we only think of soy, but there's a lot of places that you can get these isoflavones, these phytoestrogens. Now lignins are interesting. Lignins you find in this. Does anyone have any idea what this is here, this picture? This one? Flax, yes, flax seeds, I heard it, very good. So lignins are transformed in our gut by our healthy bacteria into phytoestrogen-like compounds. So this is getting like real big picture here, right? The flax in and of itself isn't necessarily the good guy. It has good qualities, but what changes it into its anti-cancer properties, particularly for hormone balancing, is the healthy gut bacteria that we have in our gut. So if you've got a history of taking antibiotics, if you have gut issues, a lot of times that means we have something called dysbiosis, an imbalance in the healthy bacteria in our gut, and that can rob us of the benefits of things like flax and other lignins, which can be beneficial to balancing hormones as well. So that's an interesting one, kind of a real functional medicine approach when we look at something like balancing hormones. Estrofactors is one of my favorite supplements to use when I'm trying to promote healthy estrogen metabolism. It really helps with a variety of hormone balancing issues, and it works pretty strongly. So that's a really good start for anyone who's interested in, okay, I know I've been exposed to a lot of these estrogens. I want to see if I can't get some of those out of my system. This would be a good idea for helping move those things along and managing that toxicity. But again, food is medicine, right? So the more we can get from these other sources, the better. Any questions? Oh, I'll get questions in a minute. Toxicity, we covered that. Let's talk about healthy body composition. So I know that's something that we hear a lot, right? Reduce your risk by losing weight, lose weight, lose weight, lose weight. Well, reducing Your fat percentage, if it's too high, can be helpful specifically when it comes to hormones. And the reason is because of two things. We've got insulin resistance, right? We associate insulin resistance with having too high of body fat composition. Insulin resistance does a couple things. It activates testosterone, which doesn't help us. In a moment, I'll explain why. It lowers this SHBG. Do we remember what that's for? The binding globulin, right? It excretes, it binds the estrogens and gets them out of the system. Insulin resistance also increases unbound estrogen in the blood, right? Both of these things are nasty. The reason we don't want testosterone going on is because of this guy, aromatase. I mentioned him earlier. Aromatase from fat makes estrogen from testosterone. So aromatase increases our estrogenic load by taking it from testosterone. Okay? This doesn't only happen in women. This happens in men. Right? Most people in their minds can picture a man with too much body fat will often start to grow breasts, right? They will develop breast tissue. And this is the reason why. Dr. Denbour often talks about feminization that happens when men consistently have too high body fat. They're making more estrogen. They're more emotional. They have a lower muscle body composition and a higher fat composition. They're not as strong. They sometimes will have issues with libido and fertility, and a lot of that comes back to estrogen because this aromatase makes a rogue estrogenic producer out of fat cells. So a lot of times when I talk to ladies, particularly if they're trying to conceive and they're way estrogenic, they have way too much estrogen, they're not cycling right, things just aren't working well. Usually, if we get fat percent down, their body stops working against them and they're able to conceive. Okay? Same goes with breast health. When we have a lot of estrogenic sensitive tissue, when we have a lot of aromatase, that is working against us. That's increasing the estrogenic load. And our body can't push it all to that 2-OH pathway. Make sense? Yeah? Timing is important for this. That was one of the things that surprised me a lot when I was researching, is that estrogen load overall, that's a tough sell when it comes to the research, because it appears that there are windows in development where having too much estrogen is more important than other times. So during puberty tends to be a very sensitive time for ladies, and unfortunately the ages of 10 to 17 tend to be some of the worst eating years of our lives. Okay, it's just one of those times when kids, they're not totally under the influence of their parents, but they're also not old enough to make really good food choices a lot of the time. And so a lot of the time the things that we're taking into our bodies during puberty are less than ideal. And a lot of women, particularly young girls, struggle with weight management during those years as well. Statistically, we've got over 33% of people in the United States who are overweight or obese. We have in Michigan 32.5, so we're keeping right up there with the national average. But more concerning is age 10 to 17, 32%. So a lot of these people are not making their own food choices, or they're not being conditioned to make good ones. And that's a big problem when it comes to breast health, because this is the window. This is a very important time for women to not be overburdened with estrogen while they're developing. There was another statistic I think I wanted to read to you. Yes. This exposure during puberty also includes things like birth control. So I know a lot of dermatologists push birth control as a way to clear skin for young ladies with acne. Unfortunately, a lot of times this increases their estrogen load. And as a result of all these xenoestrogens in our environment, in my opinion, no one has actually linked that yet, but we see 25% of girls developing breast tissue by age 8. That is insane. And it's common. 25%, a quarter of little girls have breasts at age 8. And first menarche, so first period, 12.5 years old. The turn of the century, it was 17. So what has changed, right? The influence of estrogens. The estrogens in our environment have changed drastically in that time. And we're starting to see that come to fruition in both breast disease and some of these really early feminine changes in young girls whose brains are not there yet, right? They're not teenagers at 8. They're not, but they're being asked to deal with teenager stuff, and that can be very damaging as well in other ways. Not only because it increases their length of exposure to estrogen, which increases their risk, right? So we need to be particularly careful with ladies in this puberty, early teen window. That's where we're really trying to get at kids to start there. And maintaining a healthy body composition is one way that we can do that, preventing aromatase and insulin resistance from catching hold and increasing and continuing into adulthood. Okay? So healthy body composition, what do we do? What do we do? Dr. Denbour is going to be giving a seminar next month, January, on weight loss. So come back for that one. In the meantime, a couple things that we can do. Be accountable. That's a big one. It's a big one for me. It's a big one for a lot of people that I know. We here at DBC have health coaches for that reason, for support, for accountability, for ideas. That's something that's available to everyone, okay? Be accountable. And do it as a family, right? If one of your kids, or if you are having hormone issues, or if you want to reduce your risk for breast disease, if it runs in your family, right? Don't stop with just changing your diet. Help your whole family change their diet. Everybody's going to benefit. And that way it's a lot easier. I've seen some sort of frustrating situations with patients where one person in the family is being expected to change their diet and everyone else is eating however they want. That's very isolating for anyone, adult or a child. So we want to make sure that if we're going to make health changes, if we're going to work on healthy body composition, we do it as a family, we do it as a community, we do it with accountability. We want to balance our insulin. So there are a lot of things that we can do to help with this, right? Insulin resistance is a huge problem. Avoiding sugars and processed carbs is a great way to start. We eat way too much sugar in our society. And I don't just mean white sugar. I mean honey. I mean some of the other sugars, corn syrup. There's stuff everywhere. Even overeating fruits can sometimes be a problem. We'll find that. Carbohydrates turn to sugar pretty much as soon as they hit your tongue. So even if you're not eating sugar, if you're eating a lot of grains or cereals, sometimes that can be a problem for insulin resistance. So we want to balance those foods out. Protein, healthy fats, and fiber should be the main part of your meal. Healthy fats is a big one we don't get enough of. We fill in a lot of the cracks with carbs. That's how I was raised. And I know a lot of people were too. So filling in those things with proteins, healthy fats, and fibers help level out insulin. They create a long-lasting energy release, and you'll feel the difference. You won't be up and down. You won't be emotional. You won't be lightheaded at 2 o'clock because you skipped lunch, right? This is about balancing out blood sugar. We can do that externally through foods. And also we need to be active. We need to do interval training. Interval training is the best way to drop fat percent. You don't have to run 5 miles every day. You don't. You just got to get your heart rate up. Hit it and quit it. That's what Dr. Denbour says. We want to get heart rate up and down and up and down. Do that varied intervals, and that's what helps you burn the most fat. So interval training is really helpful, especially for busy folks. 25 minutes every other day. Most people can fit that in somewhere. We will also use some supplements to help balance blood sugar. Ultrameal Cardio 360 is the one that springs to mind right away because it can be a meal replacement. So that's helpful for people who skip meals or who need to eat more frequently. It's easy, it tastes pretty good. It's got low sugar and it balances out your blood sugar with a derivative from hops. So it actually has therapeutic value as well as food value. So that's something to look into if you're looking for an easy way to start balancing your blood sugar and you need a little help. Ultrameal Cardio can help with that. And then we need to eat plants. I know we talked about some plants already, some plants that we need to eat, but let's get specific. Specific ones that really can help decrease our risk for breast disease. So phytoestrogens we covered, right? What were some of the phytoestrogens I talked about? Soy. Beans. Flax is the lignans, yes. Colorful fruits, yep. Apples, greens. Okay, so phytoestrogens. We've got this group of compounds called polyphenols, ECGC, big long name, I can never say it right, so we're going to stick with ECGC, but it's found in green tea. You've heard of green tea being anti-cancer, right? This ECGC increases apoptosis or breaking up of the programmed cell death of cancer cells. That's been shown in research. It's a crazy powerful antioxidant. What do antioxidants do? Does anyone know? What are they useful for?
Inflammation.
Yes, decreasing inflammatory damaging processes, right? Oxidation is bad. It breaks up tissue. It's not good. So antioxidants prevent that oxidization and inflammation in a tissue. So ECGC is crazy good at that, and it actually prevents you from developing cancer. So not only is it good at helping your body kill cancer if you have it, but it actually prevents that cancer process as well. So loading up on the ECGC via some green tea is always a good idea as well. We talk about medicinal mushrooms or fungi. Over 31 random controlled trials, including almost 10,000 cancer patients, showed that if you're looking at a 10-year breast cancer survival rate, okay, if you've got chemo alone, that for breast cancer, you had a 65% chance of surviving for 10 years, okay? If you used medicinal fungi, that went up to 81%. If you had a specific type, HLA-B40, so they're starting to genotype these cancers, right? Particularly breast cancer. If you had that type, it went from 55 to 100%. That's crazy. That's from food. That's from plants. Okay, medicinal fungi, and there's lots of different kinds. We have a blend, I didn't put it up here, called mycotaki. You may have heard of mycoferon. We don't have that anymore, we used to. There's lots of ways to get these mushrooms into your diet, which is very helpful for controlling and preventing breast disease and breast cancers as well. Cruciferous veggies, a lot of people have heard of this one. We pull a couple compounds out of this to talk about. Indole 3-carbinol that's how we get the name meta-IC3 over here. I3C, I always say that backwards. Meta-I3C, indole 3-carbinol. Indole 3-carbinol specifically, what does it do? Oh yeah, that's our 2-OH pusher. So it pushes you towards that 2-OH pathway. It keeps you away from the 16 one. And then the sulforaphane helps you bind. So this is also really good for protection from prostate cancer. Sulfation is one of the ways the liver gets rid of toxins in our bodies, estrogens particularly. And if we're increasing the liver's ability to do this sulfation process, then we do a lot better with binding and excreting these hormones. Okay, so that's all from cruciferous veggies. Name some cruciferous veggies. Anybody? Cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels, cabbage, right? Lots of really good stuff. Kale, yep, lots of very common leafy greens in that cruciferous veggie. And if you don't tolerate these, right? Some people will say, oof, they just don't make me feel well. It's probably because you need a little help sulfating. You need a little help breaking those things down, digesting those. And that's something we can help with. Otherwise, it could be your gut bacteria is not balanced, and so you're fermenting them instead of digesting them. And that's something that we can handle with pre and probiotics as well. So that should be an indicator too that, ooh, if I don't do well with these, that might mean that I have a sulfation issue and I should start making my liver, make sure my liver can do what it needs to do. Okay? So a couple different types of plants that are really super helpful for managing that. So a lot of folks will say to me, oh, Dr. Kate, I've got breast cancer on both sides. Both my grandmas had it, my mom had it. I just know I'm going to get it. There's nothing I can do. It's in my genetics. I've got the genes. Genes do not determine our fate. They determine our risk. Genes set the stage, but the environment determines what happens on the stage. Okay? We can control this. It's possible. There are lots of things that we just discussed that we can do to modulate that gene expression. Okay? It's about how your genes get turned into action more than it is about what your genes are, especially when it has to do with breast health. Okay? It's our risk, not our fate. Here are all the ways that we can modulate gene expression. IC3, lignans, lignans and lignins both do different things. Isoflavones, curcumin. Who knows about curcumin? Yeah, anti-inflammatory, right? Lycopene. Where do we get lycopene? Tomatoes. That's the most common, but a lot of different places. Very potent antioxidant. Flavonoids from tea, that ECGC. And then our nutrients, B vitamins, to encourage methylation. Methylation is part of the detox process. A lot of us have genetics that mean that we don't do it very well, so we have to pre-methylate our B vitamins. We need to make sure we push that pathway. Vitamins E, A, and D, we know those fat-soluble vitamins are particularly antioxidant. Magnesium, calcium, N-acetylcysteine, omega-3 fatty acids, ALA, CLA, lipoic acid, all of these things have shown evidence, solid science, that we can modulate how our genes are expressed. This is all accessible to us. Genes do not determine our fate. Okay? That's one of the main reasons we need to eat more plants, is to make sure that our genes behave, that they do what we want them to do, particularly when it comes to breast health. So keys to breast health, reducing our risk. Risk reduction is possible. The earlier the better. Remember that window? So we want to try to work on risk reduction as soon as we can. It's simple. We talked about managing toxicity, maintaining a healthy body composition, and eating plants. All of these things play a big role. And remember, it is possible to alter those gene expressions. It doesn't have to be your fate. There's lots of things that we can do to reduce our risk. There is a lot of fear surrounding breast disease. There is a lot of fear. There is a lot of aggressive language. We talk about fighting. We talk about killing. We talk about getting rid of, right? When we talk about breast disease. But working with our body preventatively can ease a lot of those fears, can make us feel like we're in control, because we are. And taking that control back for ourselves with our lifestyle dramatically reduces the stress that's associated with some of these conditions, or with the risk of some of these conditions too. And that's a big one that people don't talk about, is the fear and the stress that goes along with some of this stuff that we can also modify by taking control. Thank you for your attention. I'll take some questions now. Yes?
Your Xenoestrogen page, you had an estrogenic response that you said was becoming more and more obvious in younger and younger girls, namely breast development by age 8 and
Yes.
by age 12.
Yes.
What other ways does that manifest, if that is something that should be
Well, my argument is that it manifests in breast disease later in life. So not only is it affecting women, early women, right, pubescent teenagers, but it increases our chances and our risk, and that's part of the reason we're seeing increased breast cancers and breast diseases later in life as well. So that's the argument, that we're seeing these things change early, and then we're seeing these things change later, and more women having trouble through menopause as well, right? Hormone replacement therapy being a thing that, that increases overall risk too. So the fact that our cycles are being influenced by these xenoestrogens.
And also being managed, medically speaking, by this new up and coming birth control that stops a girl's cycle for up to a year.
Sure, yeah.
And how in the world can that be helpful?
I don't, I know how it could be helpful. I mean, I'm sure there's more than one woman here who would have liked to not have their period sometimes, but healthy is a different thing. Yeah, I don't advise using those types of birth control options, the ones that stop everything in their tracks, mostly because I worry about someone's ability to get pregnant later on too, if they're just quitting cycling altogether. But I don't really know enough about what those specific ones are made out of to know if they're increasing our estrogenic load or not specifically, but I know any sort of oral birth control that includes estrogen, or even some of the IUDs that have estrogen from are progesterone based, but if there is any estrogen that you're taking in, all of that needs to be processed by the body, and that just increases our chances of pushing it towards that 16, right? I mean, I stress again, our body's supposed to be able to do all this. I mean, our body's supposed to be able to handle the estrogens that we make. It's just when we pile it on, our bodies can get behind and backed up, and that's when we start heading towards the wrong direction.
Can you explain something about drainage from the breasts and blocked milk ducts?
Blocked milk ducts, so mastitis?
No,
or because you can, I mean, a lot of times lactating women will have a blocked duct, and that can turn into an infection that's very painful and often treated with antibiotics or topicals or that kind of stuff. That mastitis is nasty. If anybody's ever had that, that's ouchy. But drainage from the breast post-lactation typically, in my experience, has been a warning sign that something else is going on with hormones, because there's we shouldn't be, well, I guess it depends what it is. If it's something like, I guess, blood or pus or something like that, that could indicate a ductal infection or something else going on in the breast. Just the same way a dimpling or a lump can also indicate deeper problems in the breast. If it's drainage like colostrum or some milk or something, leftovers or strange remnants, that could mean something's off with prolactin, which could be a pituitary issue, or it could be an estrogen-progesterone balance issue. But yeah, that's a little bit more complicated, I would say, more individualized as to what, we'd have to dig a little bit and figure out why that's happening or what's going on. And I would say probably a little less common too. Yes, perfect.
If you're a recent in remission breast cancer
patient,
what would be the best lifestyle change to make? There's a lot of them, but what would be the most beneficial?
Oh, recent remission. So I would say probably at that, well, it depends, but my personal stance would be to reduce toxicity and eat a lot of the phytonutrients and the plant-based stuff to help reduce overall xenoestrogen exposure, probably because you've also had some toxicity from treatment, right? Whether it was chemo or radiation or whatever. So I would say go after toxicity first, and then start working on some of the preventative stuff, pushing down that 2-OH pathway. So your cruciferous veggies and your phytoestrogens, your lignans, your fibers, that kind of stuff. So I would focus more on adding in, and then the reason I say that is because I think if you're eating more of that stuff and doing more of that stuff, you're naturally gonna reduce your fat composition, right? If you're really focusing on getting all of those foods in, it's gonna be a little, you know, sort of a byproduct of you're gonna eat less processed foods, you're gonna eat less sugars, and then therefore the fat percent would go down. So it'd be my way of like, my cheater way of getting both things to focus on those first. And then you naturally, hopefully would move that direction. Yeah. And a lot of these things too, you know, I struggle to get cruciferous vegetables in every day. So that might be a reason to take some of these supplements so that you can get really high dose concentrations of these things without having to drown in broccoli, right? I mean, a lot of times we can't get enough just from our food. So that might be a reason to also do some supplementation of your diet. Yeah.
Real quick, so obviously BPA canned vegetables are not ideal, but we can't always have access to fresh things like broccoli, so frozen is the best way to go?
Frozen's great, just don't steam it in those steamer bags, right? I mean, that's people will be like, oh, so I got this frozen, I just throw it in the microwave, and I'm like, no, don't, that's like the opposite of what we want to do, right? So, but yeah, that's a really good way to do it. Frozen is awesome, yeah. And again, like we said at the beginning, it's about managing, because you can't avoid everything. It's just, that's life. So we try to just make sure that our bodies are capable and ready to get all this stuff out that they're made to do. It's made to do that. It's just, we want to minimize, right? Yeah, and that's a good way to do it. Absolutely. Cool. Well, thank you guys so much for coming out. This is a subject I'm super passionate about, so I hope that came through. And I really appreciate everybody coming. So thanks for your questions too. Thank you very much. Thanks.